huge welcome, Bram Govaerts from CIMMYT. It was always an honor to know you, but it's even bigger honor to have you here.
No, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to share.
As you know, the context is 40 years of Intact Academies. For 40 years, we've been helping businesses innovate. And on the other side, I've been training up people who can accompany that innovation. So coaches, consultants, leaders. I had the honor of working with CIMMYT for a very short time, but a very memorable time many years ago. And I know you progressed, changed immeasurably. But perhaps we could start with you introducing yourself. Who are you today, Bram?
My name is Dr. Bram Govaerts, as you already said, and I'm the Director General of CIMMYT. CIMMYT is an international research organization on maize and wheat, corn and wheat, depending from where you're from. And so basically we safeguard biodiversity, but we also generate new seeds globally and better sustainable farming practices. So responsible for food security globally with two of the three most important crops we all eat every day, which is maize, corn, and wheat. And the third crop is, of course, rice, as you know.
This is a very important work for the world today. With global warming, you already knew all this when you started, but maybe you can take us back to the moment you started. How long ago? 20 years ago?
20 years ago, I think it's fair to say, roughly. So I started at CIMMYT as a postdoc, and I've been growing through the ranks, like they say. I always did side things with private sector, with the academic sector. Of course, the unique opportunity within CIMMYT is that there's a direct link between what you do and on-the-ground impact and feeding the world. So that has always been the drive. I've had the honor to lead more like the innovation space in CIMMYT and carve that out. And I have to thank the previous directors generals for giving me the opportunity to actually do that. And I think at that point, I was more leading the innovation and change from within, generating new ways of working, etc., but kind of a department or a unit or a cell, kind of an innovation cell within the organization, and slowly contaminating the rest of the organization until at the start of the pandemic, I was asked to basically take over the day-to-day management of the organization within Mexico, not knowing that the pandemic was going to take us, the COVID was going to take us 2.5 years. I had the honor and the challenge to pull CIMMYT through that COVID period and was then asked to take over as a Director General for an interim period, and then recently, 1.5 years ago, confirmed. So right now the change processes are really looking at the entire organization, which is a bit of a different perspective, but it uses similar recipes probably.
I'm really interested in those recipes as well, because one of the things I really admire about you is that you have always believed in participative change, in co-creating the change with the end user, really. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you went about that.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting. I think when I started my career, the co-creation was with farmers, and so one of the tools we were using was can we get to the similar page or to a shared space by expressing what a better future could look like, by expressing what do we want to achieve actually together. So I did a whole process of transformational scenario building with farmers. I then repeated the same thing actually with all stakeholders in Mexico. So we developed a methodology to look at what we back then called maize for Mexico, wheat for Mexico, beans for Mexico. So what does it look like? And so design different transformational scenarios together with the stakeholders. That was with NGOs, with the private sector, with the public sector, with etc. And then at CIMMYT, basically did a little bit the same. CIMMYT is an 80 years old organization, has a huge legacy. So many know Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970s for having saved 1 billion lives, is actually the founding father of CIMMYT. So huge legacy on which we stand. That also comes with criticism. He was the father of the Green Revolution, and there has been criticism to that model. So we did the whole exercise across the organization, what we call to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Green Revolution, because the organization was struggling and there was a pendulum from kind of saying everything done in the past was great, and we are standing on that legacy, and we need to continue that legacy, or the whole other side kind of trying to scrub everything from the legacy out of the organization and saying enough Borlaug, we don't talk about him anymore. And I think none of the two are actually very healthy. I think it is about projecting the future, recognizing your past, and learning from that past. So we did that exercise. Those transformational scenarios were built throughout and with input from the whole organization. And once we had those, we started a process that I call strategy, structure, people, culture. And the strategy process was championed by what we call the Emerging Thought Leader Group. This was a group of leaders from throughout the organization, not the typical management, not the program directors, not the director general, not the deputy director general, but we actually identified those leaders in the organization that then did the whole strategy process in a very participatory way. They then we organized a big Science and Innovation Week. We will have our next one 2 weeks from now. So the first one was 2 years ago, where we all looked at the strategy. The last changes were made. And since then, the strategy was launched a year and a half ago. And then the next step was the structure, really looking at what is our primary process, what are our two secondary processes, and how can we design now a structure around that. And in that structure discussion, we came, for example, now CIMMYT is organized around 3 chapters. Science and Innovation chapter, because that's what we do. Science and Innovation, that's our primary process. But we also found out that we needed an engagement chapter, and we didn't have that before, because external engagement, donor engagement, stakeholder engagement is as important as a secondary process as the inward secondary process, which is the typical operations, right? HR, finance, etc. So I think that was a very key learning from that process, but also just the fact that we called it chapters, because it's like chapters of a book, right? You can read the first chapter on its own, but you never get the full story if you read the chapters on their own, isolated. Chapters need to be coherent, right? You cannot kill the character in chapter number 1 and bring it back to life in chapter number 2. That's only in Mexican telenovelas, but in a good book, you try to be coherent between and consistent between chapters. And chapters have different functions, right? It's not the same to be the introductory chapter or to be the closing chapter of a book or to be that mid piece. So they all have their own function. They all have their own way of being written, but they need to be coherent and consistent to tell that full CIMMYT story. Go ahead, Dr.
3 processes. You named 2: a primary process, one primary process, one secondary process engaged.
Secondary process is the operation per se. So it is HR, finance, but for us also logistics, right? Because we have offices in 17 countries, very different cultures, very different ways of doing business, and we have impact in 80 countries. So how do you bring that together in a coherent way, understanding that business is done very different in Senegal or in Zambia than it is done in India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan?
That is a huge question, because creating a strategy is one thing, but executing it is a completely different animal. And you have 80 different countries where you have impact, 70 countries where you're working. So how do you actually execute that strategy? What is the secret?
So I think there is not like one secret in the execution, but I think it's the consciousness that strategy needs to be your North Star or your South Star, or to not use cliche, or where you are going towards, while you then have to consciously design the tactics and the people that will execute that. And that tactical piece is very different depending on the countries where we are, because if you again do a strategy translation based on the countries where we are, or based on the science area, because we have different science areas. We have maize, we have wheat, we have agronomy, and in the end it all needs to come together. Also, let's not be naive. In the end, you need to get the resources to do the job. We are an organization that has no core funding. There's not one government taking care of us. We need to every year get the resources. And CIMMYT was at the point when we did the strategy process where we were actually in the one of the lowest points of funding in its history. Since then, between 2020 and 2023, we increased our operations with 40%. Between 2023 and 2024, we increased it with another 55%. Knowing that we need to increase it again this year if we want to be at a position of operation that we really can make a difference.
Yeah.
Because if we would go below, you become irrelevant, right? You cannot be a small player while you have 2 of the crops that feed the world. you need to have sufficient response capability, footprint globally to be relevant. So I think also that was a very important question of the relevance. And with that is connected the KPIs or the performance indicators. We are looking at indicators with which we track, but it's not like indicators for indicators. They're rather like canaries in a coal mine. We want to see the canary getting nervous because there is an issue so we can respond. Not just KPI driven, but rather KPIs as a clarity in early warning systems so we can adjust the strategy when needed. And of course, the world is turbulent right now. So how do we respond to that uncertainty is going to be an important test for our strategy.
So what role do you play in this? Because I know you as someone who not only does stakeholder participation in the innovation process, but you also do participation in your leadership. So what is your role in that? How do you keep people vibrant and awake? Because really strategy execution is a question of repetition a lot of the time. You know, you have to repeat and repeat and repeat.
And I think the role has shifted, right? It was my first role was to really keep the organization focused while we were doing the strategy process. And during the strategy process, my role was actually a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a policeman, but at least a traffic controller to say, no, let those emerging thought leader group come up with what they want to come up. No, you as a program director or a higher level, maybe decision maker that is used to and gets a bit nervous, what are those people cooking up? Give them the space. But also the other way around. Tell the emerging thought leader group to, well, there will be input from those in those leadership positions, because they may have had some experiences. They may have some input to give around guardrails and boundaries that are important to consider, or risks that you should include. Then I think it shifted more of championing and really communicating that strategy very broadly, and that is still part of the job. But today it has shifted again, and it's more now that the structure and the people are in place. I see my role more as championing the culture that needs to underpin the strategy. While I keep, of course, professing or repeating the strategy. I just sent out a message this morning. What do we do when there is uncertainty? Go back to the basics, go back to the strategy. We had 4 scenarios, and actually one of those scenarios was very close to what is happening today. So we had foreseen some no regret actions within that scenario before it was happening. So let's go back to that. So it's that role of reminding people that we have the strategy, that we should not get distracted, but it's also more championing now the culture and empowering the people that sit in the structure to be equal champions and those that repeat the strategy than myself. So the role has been shifting, and I foresee another shift probably, which is then initiating a refresh or a rethinking of that same strategy in a year and a half from now, as external environment will have changed.
That's a beautiful description, and it's actually what we do as well in the innovation for business. We start with purpose and strategy, and then structure, and then how do you cooperate within that structure, and then, you know, the guardian of the culture. Because you're really leading a global change. It's absolutely amazing and so necessary in the world today, you know, with global warming, that we have actually seeds that still work in this climate, and then to get the funding for it. It's amazing work that you're doing. What would you say to people who are starting their change management journey? Because I often have leaders who go from regional to global, and they kind of falter at that space because, you know, it takes a different kind of competency to envision that. Even you've gone through it. You've grown from being a postdoc student to being the global leader now. What are lessons you learned that you would like to pass on?
Yeah, I think, and some of them maybe sound like cliches, but I think the consciousness that what made you successful getting to the position you're starting will not make you successful in that position. And be ruthless about saying everything I knew, I need to really look at it. I need to take the time to actually say, what does this now mean in my new position? I mean, that has been very crucial.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, for example, you may tend to say, let me just work harder and do the same. It's not possible. You need to start delegating on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, also, as you move to a global position, even your delegation needs to be very different with different people, right? So you're no longer task delegating to some, you need to go to objective delegation. which also means you probably have to accept an 80-20 and think, well, that's not the way I would have gone to Rome, but if it goes to Rome, it's fine. While if you are at a more local position, you probably take, or regional, you probably take that context for given because it's a homogeneous factor. As you go up, that context is actually a very strong driver in how you should behave and how you should express and how you should interact and communicate. You're no longer one version of yourself. You need to be multiple versions of yourself, honest to yourself and always to your own self, right? You need to increase certain aspects of your being in a different way or over-index on some things depending on the context where you globally are going to engage it. And then being very conscious, if I bring my leadership together, I need to make like a potpourri that still smells nice because there's all kind of people with very different backgrounds, with very different ways of processing the information. And we want those people to work together, probably being conscious that they're all coming from different backgrounds, cultures, but also one is sitting in Africa, probably asleep, because it's late in the evening. The other one hasn't had enough coffee because he's waking up in Mexico, and the one in Europe is thinking about how to get the kids from school. So I mean, people are sitting with very different mindsets, but even times of the day, right, around the table. I think another very key one is don't look for one like coach or guider or role figure, or look for multiple and distill from that what works for you. As you go up, one is not going to be enough, and you probably get the most wisdom out of confrontation between different viewpoints, and then you make your own kind of pathway out of that. And the third learning is it's not the same to be number 2 than to be number 1. So the pressure of the final responsibility for 1,500 people as 1,500 that work in CIMMYT, but probably 100-fold of that as all partners that depend on CIMMYT, and then 1,000, if not more, fold of that as those that depend on what we do every day. That is quite a load to carry when you are number 1 or the last responsible. At the same time, the reward you can get from that and the honor to receive that reward is extremely privileged, right? It's an extremely unique position to be in. But for me, it required even more capacity of compartmentalize, in a sense that those moments you have for your own and where you need to say, this is now me, my family, my personal stronghold, those moments, however small they are, to maximize and be really strict about protecting those so you can recharge and get new ideas. And for a moment, just being the person that has nice family members is not just enjoying a movie or a theater play and leave for a moment all the rest outside the door.
No, fantastic. Thank you very much for your time. I know you have to catch a plane as well. So I wish you well, and I hope to meet you along the way for many years to come.
Of course, I hope that this can inspire others, and it's always welcome. Happy to have conversations and to share more about the work we do. Thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Thank you, Bram.